in week 2 of this series called Talking Points. And it is an important conversation. It's an uncomfortable conversation. If you were here last week, you may have felt that. But if you were here last week, I just want to say kudos for coming back. Like, that's just, that's good on you. Because it can be uncomfortable when we talk about this series. Like I said, we are in week 2 of Talking Points, the perfect blend of politics and religion. Things that we don't like to lump together quite often. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this. But I believe not only is this uncomfortable sometimes, but it's also going to be helpful for us. It's kind of like braces. Anybody have braces growing up? Right? They were uncomfortable. I had braces twice. I had braces for a number of years, and then I got them off, and I mean, you're going to feel really bad for my parents here in a second. I got them off, and then I got in a horrific bicycle accident that basically took my teeth off the bone that held them in. And then I had to get them kind of reset, and had to put braces back on to realign them. Could you just imagine what my parents were kind of thinking when they had to get the braces back on? Getting braces tightened a little bit, that's uncomfortable, right? Emotionally uncomfortable, right? Because when you have braces, it's not easy to meet girls. Wasn't. I mean, you can meet them, they just didn't want to have anything to do with you. But it's just like, it's uncomfortable, but they were helpful because after they were done, all of a sudden you have like this aligned smile, and it's uncomfortable but helpful, kind of like this series. Uncomfortable but helpful. Just think about that. So we are in this series. The tension that as Christians, and I just want to kind of talk about this because we like to be a church where we're open to you having questions, you're coming with your doubts. We love that. We want to create an environment for that. If you're on your journey, you're not sure what you believe, that is great. You are in the right place. Today, I'm going to talk about this tension that we as Christ followers have in this little kind of arena, in this conversation. And I think as people who are kind of exploring faith, this might be helpful to you. But it is going to be geared towards people who claim to be Christ followers. And the tension is this that we must attend to. Are we willing to evaluate your politics? This is the big question that we asked last week. Are you willing to evaluate your politics through the filter of our Christian faith rather than create a version of faith that supports your politics? Are you willing to do that? Are you even able to do that? It might be a better question. Are you willing to evaluate or maybe reevaluate your politics through the filter of faith rather than create a version of faith that supports your politics? Another way of asking this question is, are we willing to put our faith filter ahead of our political filter? Are we willing or even able to put our faith filter ahead of our political filter? And if we're willing to do this, it creates kind of space between us and the party that you affiliate with, or us as Christ followers and maybe your party's platform, and maybe us as Christ followers and maybe your party's candidate. It just creates a little bit of space. It creates a little bit of space because really that's kind of that's the thing that Jesus prayed for. And that's what we talked about last week. He prayed that we would be one as followers of Christ, that we would be unified, that we would be one, not all thinking the same. So last week we talked about how we can disagree politically, but we should also love unconditionally, and we should pray for unity. We can disagree politically because we're not all going to think the same thing about every single issue. It determines how we were raised, who we were raised by, our experiences, our things that were kind of instilled in us, where we grew up. There's a lot of different factors. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. But we can disagree politically, but at the same time, love unconditionally, especially all people, especially those who disagree with you, right? But pray for unity. Jesus prayed to the Father. This is his prayer request, that we would be one as him and the Father are one, so that the world would believe and would know that God sent Jesus into the world. Like and Jesus kind of came and gave this command that we were supposed to love one another as Christ loved us, as he loved us. He's telling his disciples this, right? Before he's arrested and tried and crucified and all the things that happen really fast, he's talking to his disciples at this final kind of Passover celebration. He says, new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. And by that unique style of love, people will know that you follow me. Because it's going to be alarming. It's going to be otherworldly. It's not going to make sense in the world. But by that unique style of love, everyone's going to know that you follow me. And here's the thing: the common thing that we have now with even that crowd, that first century crowd, the common thing that we even have now, and you'll see this all over the place. Everybody wants a piece of Jesus. Everybody wanted a piece of Jesus. Back in Jesus' day, everybody wanted a piece of Jesus, right? Religious law leaders would come to Jesus, and they would corner him, and they'd question him, and they'd try to get him to agree with them. Everybody wanted a piece of Jesus, and they wanted him to choose their side. So the Pharisees wanted him to choose their side. The other crowd wanted him to choose their side. Everybody wanted a piece of Jesus, and that's true today. It's true today. If Jesus walked around right now, each political party and those kind of unaffiliated all want Jesus to choose their side. And they believe they would be on the right. They believe that he would be on their side. If you ask them, he'd be like, yeah, Jesus is on our side. Of course, we're right. Doesn't matter. Republican, Democrat, Independent. Republicans would say Jesus would be a Republican because of his values or whatever. And Democrats would say Jesus would be, of course, he would be a Democrat because of his care and concern for people, maybe especially the poor, the marginalized. And everybody wants a piece of Jesus. And Independents would be like, you know what, Jesus is both and so why don't he needs to come and be part of us. And everybody wants a piece of Jesus. Here's the interesting thing: if you were to come to me and say, give me like a sermon assignment, and say, Jason, I want you to write a sermon that on how the Republican platform and values kind of sync in with the teachings of Jesus. I could do that. And if you're like, Jason, I want you to kind of take the Democratic platform and write a message about how it's in sync with the teachings of Jesus, I could do that as well. Everybody wants a piece of Jesus. But when you interpret the words of Jesus through your political filter, it's amazing. Both sides use the Bible, right? Both sides use the Bible. Both sides quote Jesus. Both sides even quote from the same verses. It's amazing. It's crazy when you kind of listen to it. It's like, what's even going on? And so as the tension that we have to kind of go through this aspect of our lives in is that question: are we willing to evaluate or reevaluate our politics through the filter of our faith rather than create a version of faith that supports our politics? If we do that, then all of a sudden it becomes something that we can actually bear, but it is very tough to do. In fact, we talked last week about most people and most Christians do not do that. They do not put their faith filter ahead of their political filter. It's the other way around, and that's what creates disunity. That's what creates division. And so that's why we are in the mess that we're in. So the question is this: can we put our Jesus filter, our faith filter, ahead of our political filter? It's a very, very difficult thing to do. Now, famous pastor, thinker, theologian Tony Evans, he's a pastor in Dallas area. He said this, and this is I believe this is so true. He said this: Jesus didn't come to take sides. He came to take over. And that may on the surface feel like, whoa, okay. But that's kind of true. He didn't come to choose sides. He came to Jesus came to create a whole new, the kingdom of heaven has come. And this is what it means to be part of the kingdom of heaven. And this is how you access the kingdom of heaven. It wasn't like, okay, I'm going to come and choose the Jewish side or the Roman side or whatever. I came to create a new thing, and this new thing is going to take over the world. Jesus didn't come to choose sides or to take sides. He came to take over. He came to introduce the kingdom of God to earth, the values of God to earth. This upside down kingdom where those with the wealth and the power leverage that for those who have less. The kingdom where the king laid down his life for his subjects rather than asking his subjects to lay down their lives for him. This kingdom that is all inclusive and broad and said everybody is welcome and everybody is invited to participate in it. Everybody's invited to participate in it. And this is why it is so foolish for the church to be divided over a political candidate or a political party, because at the end of the day, no party will line up perfectly with kingdom values of Jesus. Although each party will say, hey, they take a little bit of it, and we're like, Jesus is on our side. Jesus is on our side. And even though that is difficult for some of us to acknowledge, it's foolish for us to be divided because we are supposed to be kingdom people first. If we're just going to settle on something, we're supposed to be kingdom people first. Not Democrats first, not Republicans first, not independent, not affiliated with any political party first. We're supposed to be kingdom people first. So today I want to give you a template and help you to understand where kind of this agreement ends and this disagreement or division and diverse opinions actually begin. We're going to talk a little bit about this because I think this will be eye-opening to many of us, if not all of us, and I think it'll help us transform. Remember, the whole big idea of this conversation is for us to create a biblical framework and of how we to view this. It starts with putting our faith filter ahead of our political filter. But how do we do that? And so we're going to talk a little bit about, so give you a little bit of a template to help understand where agreement ends and diverse opinions begin. So Paul, the Apostle Paul, he hated Christians, was martyring them, helping people kill Christians. He was a Pharisee. He was super educated. He becomes a Jesus follower, has a miraculous encounter with Jesus, becomes a Jesus follower, and he has the distinction of also being a Roman citizen. He was all over the map, right? He was a Jewish person. He was in that camp. He was a Pharisee in the Jewish, as a Jewish person. So he was high up. He was super educated. Became a Jesus follower, and he was a Roman citizen. He had affiliations all over the place, and he uses this phrase that kind of will give us a great starting point for this template. And the phrase is this: it's the law of Christ. The law of Christ. What is the law of Christ, right? But he says this. He talks about this. The law of Christ was shorthand for Jesus' new covenant command that we talk about all the time. Hey, love one another as I have loved you. By this unique command, by this unique brand of new covenant love, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another as I have loved you. And it's a two-way thing. It's a community thing. It's a family thing. It's not just loving one another the way that you want to love one another. It's loving them as Jesus has loved you. So taking your cues from Jesus, love other people. That's a little bit different spin. Sometimes we're like, I love them the way that I kind of want to love, the way that I love them. And that should be good enough. That's not what Jesus said, right? Love them as he loved them. So Paul takes this idea and he incorporates it in all his letters in this uniting ethic for all Jesus followers. And not just Paul, others did this as well. John did this as well. Others did this as well. So this phrase, the law of Christ, is his way to take readers back to that moment when Jesus gave this new covenant command, this big idea, this kingdom ethic. And it was the marching orders for those who follow Jesus. So we're going to look at a couple different passages where Paul talks about this. The first is in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Beginning in verse 19, he says this: even though I am a free man with no master, I have become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. Another translation says, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. Right? And that's a strong word. That's strong language. But Paul was on a mission. He doesn't have much time left. He did a lot of damage to the church. He let a lot of people in the church, a lot of people in the early church, he helped them be killed, be martyred off for this sake. He doesn't have a lot of time. And he's willing to do anything short of sin to help win as many people as possible, to let Gentiles know that God has done something for them and for the world. And he's on a mission. He's not going to let anybody get in his way. And so he says, even though I'm a free man, with no master, I've become a slave to all people, to win as many people to Christ. And he goes on and says, when I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. And when I was with those who follow the Jewish law, I too lived under the law. Even though I am not subject to that law, I did this to bring to Christ those who are under the law. That's a whole lot of words to basically say, hey, when I was around Jewish people, I acted like, I was there with them. I resonated with them. I related to them so that I could, even though I'm not subject to that law, I became subject to the law so that I could win them, so that I could relate to them, and so I could kind of speak on their level. And then he goes on to say, when I'm with the Gentiles, I do not follow the Jewish law. I too live apart from that law so that I can bring them to Christ. I do not ignore the law of God. I obey the law of Christ. I do not ignore the law of God. I obey the law of Christ. That sounds like the same thing, right? But what he's talking about is the law of God was the Torah, was the Jewish law, was what everybody was accustomed to. But the law of Christ is this new kingdom ethic that Jesus has ushered into the world. Paul pulled out under the Torah, but is still under the authority of God. He says, though I am not free from the law of God, I'm under the law of Christ. And again, in another passage, he's talking to the church in Galatia, and we find this in Galatians chapter 6. He says this, he says, carry each other's burdens or share each other's burdens, and in this way obey the law of Christ. Another translation says, carry each other's burdens, and this way you fulfill the law of Christ. So if you see people that are burdened, we're supposed to share with that. We're supposed to carry each other's burdens. You see somebody burdened financially, or burdened with kids, or burdened with work, or burdened with a physical ailment, or burdened like they've just been tripped up in life. You are to carry each other's burdens. And if you do, you fulfill the law of Christ. You are to love one another as Christ has loved you. And when the concerns of others concern you, you are fulfilling the law of Christ. When the concerns of others concern you, you are fulfilling the law of Christ. So as Jesus followers of all political persuasions, the law of Christ is our marching orders. It's our marching. It's the first thing. It's the first thing in this template to help us make our faith filter ahead of our political filter. The law of Christ is the preeminent thing that should take root in our lives. And when the law of Christ, our marching orders happen, it should do the second thing, which is inform our conscience. We should have an informed conscience. Our conscience over time should be hardwired to the law of Christ. So when we do something contrary to loving people as Christ loved us, it should bother us. It should ding us. It should be a weight on us. It should bother us collectively, right? It should ding our conscience. And as a collective body, we should be disturbed, and we should be irritated, and we should be convicted when something happens to people. When we see injustice, we should be disturbed. We should be irritated. We should be convicted. When we see disrespect, when we see somebody undermining their future or their health or their kids, or they're undermining their integrity of their family or society, we should be moved by that. We should be moved to action. It should ding our conscience. Whenever we see someone expressing autonomy that undermines their family or the health of their community or our community, that should bother us collectively. Our collective conscience should go off. And when we see that outside the church, it should bother us as well. I mean, we need to be measured in our response, but our collective conscience should move us toward apology, move us toward action. Just as Christ did for you, love other people, respect other people, fight for the dignity of other people. Jesus was not concerned with guilt by association. If he was concerned with that, it would be weird, right? Because he left heaven for you, who, as Paul puts it, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were deficient, while we brought nothing to the table, while we were actually a negative, Christ died for us. He wasn't worried about guilt by association. He left heaven for us to take your cue about how to treat other people and how you treat each other from him. Because according to Jesus, if you want to set policy, if it's good for people, it's good. That's what's good. What's best for people, that's what's best. So we have this kind of overarching thing kind of in our society that we kind of gloss over a little bit. Self-evidence. In fact, we see this a lot in some of these documents, like it was self-evident, right? Things that are unquestioned, things that are obvious, things are like, duh, why are we even talking about it? It's things that are so obvious, things that we don't really even talk about. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Have you heard that phrase before? Right? These self-evidence is something that we kind of gloss over and we kind of see because it's something that we just all know. It's just kind of how it is, how we live. And there's some things that were self-evident back in the day that are not so self-evident anymore. Let's take slavery, for instance. I told you this is going to be uncomfortable. Once upon a time, it was self-evident that some people should be owned by and controlled by other people. It was just the way it was. Slavery was not a moral issue. It was just the way of things. That's the way it was viewed at that time. In fact, in 4th century BC, there's this Greek philosopher whose responsibility was to make everything make sense in the world. That's what they were trying to accomplish. They were trying to make everything make sense in the world. Science, the way people acted, behaved, they're going to try to make it all work together so that there's this holistic understanding as to how the world works. And so in 4th century BC, this is what Aristotle said. He said, for that some should rule and others be ruled is not a thing that is only necessary, but it's expedient. But from their birth, some are carried out for subjection, and others for rule. Some are carried out for subjection, some are carried out for rule. Like that's just how he put it. It should not be. It's just self-evident. It's self-evident. It's not only necessary; it's expedient. This is what he said, right? And so, he's expounding on this idea that it's okay. It's not a morality thing. It's just the way the world worked. That some people were born into subjection, some people were born into rule, and it just kind of worked itself out that way. And it's just a self-evident thing. Well, 4th century AD, after Christianity had taken hold of the Roman Empire, St. Augustine, a 4th century Christian bishop, said, no, slavery is the result of sin. And suddenly a brand new idea is born from this brilliant mind in a time where slavery was still a very, very normal thing in the landscape of society everywhere. And suddenly it begins to dawn on Christians, even earlier than this, that St. Augustine says, no, slavery is not expedient. Slavery is not a part of nature. Slavery is a result of sin. And as early as the 4th century, Christians started to have misgivings and began to see discrepancies between what the scriptures say about people made in the image of God and loving as Christ loved us, and the horror of slavery. It's like, this doesn't compute, this doesn't line up, this doesn't work out. There's something that just doesn't match here. If people are made in the image of God, then why is this over here okay? And so Christians started to have some misgivings about that, about slavery. And as you know, it took a long time for it to be, and it's still in some parts of the world, still something that exists, but it took a long time for it to be eradicated in most parts of the world, right? And that's 4th century AD, where it's sort of like, hey, this is a result of sin. We're a lot later than that now, right? And we're like, nah, of course. These things started to inform our conscience. It started to kind of sit there and be like, okay, you know what? The law of Christ is starting to pervade in us as people, as a society, as a community. And all of a sudden we're realizing that some things that were just the way it was, is just self-evident. Why are we even talking about this? Maybe those things need to be relooked at and reevaluated. Second instance, or second example of this is something called infanticide, also called exposure. In fact, in the ancient Roman world, infanticide was a good for society. Infanticide is good for society. Infanticide, it was believed that it was the right thing to do. There were actually community and social laws in parts of the Roman Empire, and this is what infanticide is if you don't know what it is already, where you were required to allow your child to die. You're required for it, right? In some cases, it was because it was a girl. Sorry, girls. And you didn't have a boy yet, and you just kind of like, you know what? It was kind of population control. Or you didn't want a girl, and so you would just expose your child, right? That's why it's called exposure too. But infanticide, this is a self-evident thought. Infanticide is good for society. And so there were laws in place to make that happen. So you take your baby or place your baby just outside of your village or the edge of the forest or down by the river, and then you would go home, and legally you were not culpable for allowing your child to die or killing your child, because the fates would decide the fate of the child. Sounds awful, right? Sounds like, why would that even be legal? You were innocent. If a man was suspected that his wife became pregnant by another man, you'd take the baby and you would expose the baby. If a baby had a birth defect, you'd expose the baby. If you didn't want another little girl, you'd expose the baby. There were really no rules other than you couldn't kill the baby yourself. It was just self-evident. Sounds awful, but Christians from the very beginning disagreed. From the very beginning, Christians condemned exposure, condemned infanticide. They would often go out to the edges of where the children were often left and down by the river and would bring those children back into their own small homes with a little bit of food that they had and began to raise these children themselves. Why? Why? There was no law for that. There was no scripture that said, hey, you should do this. Why do they do that? The Old Testament doesn't talk about it. The New Testament doesn't talk about it. It's not rewarded or encouraged to do so. It didn't require it. So why? Because love required it. As they began to understand how it is to be made in the image of God, they began to understand the law of Christ. It just clicked for them. Think about it. We were like little babies that were brought into, we were adopted into the family of God. While we were still sinners, Christ gave himself for us. So there was a tension around what was just an expected tradition, what was just self-evident practice around the Roman Empire. There was tension around that. And as Christianity began to take hold and make inroads into the Roman Empire, and as the empire's conscience began to be affected by the teaching of Christianity, this is what happened. In the year 318, Emperor Constantine declared infanticide a crime. He declared it a crime. This thing that was self-evident, this thing that was duh, why are we even talking about it? Why are we questioning it? Why are we bringing it up? All of a sudden, the Roman Empire, because all of a sudden our collective conscience was getting to be informed by the teachings of Christ, he declared it a crime. He declared it a crime. And it was just one of those things where why the change? Because suddenly it became a conscience issue. It became a conscience issue because of the unity of Jesus. And because of the unity of the church around the teaching of Jesus, not only in 318 did that happen, but in 374 AD, Emperor Valentinian made it a capital offense. Made it a capital offense. So it started out as self-evident. It's just the way things were. Doesn't matter. You were completely innocent. In fact, some laws were kind of required for you to allow it to happen. And then in 374 AD, capital offense. Capital offense. He made exposure a capital offense. You could lose your life if your baby lost his life because of your neglect. When the law of Christ informs an individual, informs a community, informs a city or a nation's conscience, things change. And there's been so much change even in our nation because of this very same dynamic. It's not coincidence that we talk a little bit about human rights and about right to life in these two examples. It should tell us that there are things that when political tension is happening, that there are things that we can grab onto from the teachings of Jesus that talk more about this and support argument. It kind of goes to the whole central idea of everybody wants a piece of Jesus. But when the law of Christ begins to inform our conscience, change can happen. Jesus' single new command was so powerful, was so ahead of its time, was so modeled and baked into the crucifixion and the resurrection that it is transcultural, it is transgenerational, it sits at the epicenter of the kingdom of God's values. It will never go out of date. It doesn't have to have a shelf life. We are to forever and ever do for others what God in Christ has done for us. And this kind of ethic, this kind of morality is to inform our conscience as we have influence in the world, to inform our collective conscience of the people who aren't in the church and couldn't care less about the church. It should inform our collective conscience. That's why the church is so important, because part of our responsibility is to be salt and light to help shape the conscience of the nation, not to be divided, but to have one message, one command, one mission, like we talked about last week, to see people know Jesus, to follow Jesus, and to love each other unconditionally and love each other as Christ loved us. It is incumbent on us to be one, as Jesus prayed that we would be one in spite of our political differences. Platforms go and change, candidates go and change. We should be one. We shouldn't be divided on these things. So the law of Christ informs our conscience. And it informs our conscience with something called knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge and wisdom. The law of Christ informs our conscience, and to an informed conscience, we are to incorporate knowledge and wisdoms. And one of the greatest advantages of the human race is the ability to collect and pass on information. Think about it, right? Like dogs are dogs are dogs are dogs, right? But the advantage that we have as humans is that we are able to collect and to pass on information. Let me ask you this. Where do babies come from? It depends on who's asking, right? If a 4-year-old asks, you don't lie to them, but you give them an answer. That kind of will suffice, let's say. If a 15-year-old asks, you say, you should probably know this by now. Why are you asking me? No. If a 25-year-old is asking, maybe it's part of a graduate course, it's coming from a different level, right? Like a different answer is necessary. It depends on who's asking, right? And here's the idea, is that in other words, we don't lie, but you accommodate to the capacity of the person asking the question. That, I believe, is what God does for us. That our Heavenly Father accommodates to the capacity of his people. That's why, like in Genesis, pre-science, right? Pre-science Genesis, it's just things are just kind of happening. It's just like, these people are ancient. It's pre-science. It's pre-Tylenol. It's pre-warm shower. I mean, people didn't know what was good for them back then, right? This was a time, and then Jesus comes. And he starts explaining the kingdom of God in a completely new way, a completely different way than the Old Testament. It doesn't quite explain everything, but people's capacity have changed. Things have changed. In every generation, our knowledge grows, our knowledge increases, our insight increases, and God's ability to help us understand how he made the world and how the world works increases. It's not too much to say that every generation is smarter than the generation that came before it. Now, parents, I get it. You don't agree with that just yet because you're like, no, I'm smarter than you. But our collective information can be passed down and passed down and passed down and passed down. Our capacity is increasing and increasing and increasing. And as Christians, we should be on the forefront. We should never resist science. We should never resist discovery. We should be the most curious people because our faith is not tethered to our interpretation of a text. Our faith is tethered to an event in history, the resurrection of Jesus. So we don't need to fear new. We don't need to fear science. And every once in a while, a generation comes along that kind of gets into like a spitting match or kind of like gets into a brawl with science, and it's so foolish. It's so foolish. So we should incorporate in our informed conscience knowledge and wisdom. We should incorporate that comes from this age, that's been handed down to us from the people who come before. So the knowledge and wisdom combined with an informed conscience, that is what we should use and leverage to determine what policy and platform and legislation. This is how we put the Jesus filter, the faith filter ahead of our political filter. The law of Christ informs our conscience and incorporates knowledge and wisdom. And that affects our beliefs or our views, or our thoughts on policy, platform, and legislation. The law of Christ as a Jesus follower is not negotiable. It's something that it's going to take root. That's something that it's a mandate. It's a missional thing. This is the law of Christ. If you're following Jesus, this is something that you're kind of growing into. And an informed conscience is something that over time, as you follow Jesus, probably not right away, but over time, as you follow Jesus, your conscience is going to be more and more shaped by the law of Christ. And knowledge and wisdom is kind of a bit intuitive, right? This is why you don't call me when your children get sick anymore. Before, back, a long time ago, people would call the priest when kids got sick. You don't do that anymore, right? Because your conscience is more informed now. Now you know who to call. Call a doctor. not that I won't pray for your kid. Like, I'll pray for your kid, but you have other means. Like, you know where to go to get your kid better, right? We have a little bit more of an informed conscience. And so we don't see any conflict between these two things. We will pray and we believe that prayer changes things. We believe that miracles happen. But doctors know how the body works, and it kind of go there. We naturally and intuitively incorporate knowledge and wisdom into our thinking. And then when it comes to policy, platform, and legislation, kind of here's the big rub. Here's why it's so difficult for Christians, for Jesus followers. When it comes to this, there will always be disagreement among Christians. There will always be disagreement among Christians. The reason is, and this is where we have some work to do, and it's the reason that I hope you're open to move, hoping maybe you're open to be a little bit more open-minded, but the reason we will always have work to do is because of this phrase. It's kind of a famous phrase. Where you stand depends on where you sit. Where you stand depends on where you sit. It was coined by Rufus Miles. Miles was part of the Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson administration, and he kind of coined this phrase: "Where you stand depends on where you sit." Where you stand depends on where you. When it comes to this, there will always be disagreement. Where you take a stand depends on where you sit. Where you take a stand, where our cultural context, where you sit, our cultural context determines our perspective, our stand. Our cultural context determines our perspective. Where we sit determines where we stand. Where we stand determines where we sit. Kind of goes back and forth, right? The context, where you live, who you're related to, how much money you have, etc., right? Determines, where you stand, what you see, what you experience, how you see it, how you interpret what you see and what you experience, and this is true for all of us. This is why most of you don't see any conflict between your faith and your politics. You are loving this series because you have some friends who need to hear it, but you're good. You're like, I got this. I'm right. I don't need it. Right? You're like, amen. People need to put their faith first and their politics behind their faith second, and that's why I'm a Republican, because clearly the Republicans are right. Amen. You're right. I'm with you. And on the other hand, it's like, amen, I'm with you 100%. That's why I'm a Democrat, because, I'm right. I'm with you 100%. Faith first. That's why I'm a Democrat. Maybe. But probably not. Probably not. Because your political views, and you know this, weren't shaped in a vacuum. They weren't shaped in a vacuum. You experience those, or you form those because of a variety of things in your life. They weren't shaped in a vacuum. And pausing to recognize this and pausing long enough to incorporate this into your thinking is what it means to be mature. And man, do we need a little bit more maturity in our discussion in our nation around this. Pausing to recognize this is the way forward. It's how the extremes, if they are mature, are willing to move a little bit more toward the middle. And I'm not saying that we will all meet in the middle and become this brand new kind of party, this brand new kind of thing. There's always going to be disagreement when it comes to policy, platform, and legislation, and that's okay. That's okay. As long as we are mature enough to not allow it to divide us, it's okay. And if we are mature enough to not allow it to divide us, we will be better for the conversation. It will be a step toward unity despite political diversity. Political views and values are, like all your views and values, are shaped by a variety of things that most of which we had no control over or have no control over. And if we can acknowledge this, if we can take a deep breath, if we can learn something, and we don't change necessarily what we believe, but we gain understanding of why other people believe what they do, and we won't experience division as the church, as the Big C church, as the Little C church, as Jesus followers. Because political views are shaped by where we live, how we were raised, where we were educated, if we were educated. They're shaped by what we've been told, what we've seen, what we've experienced, what we've seen others experience. And when you combine all that together, you have not experienced it the same way as somebody else, even in this room. And I love that. I love that. These are the dynamics that shape our political viewpoint. Perhaps the best evidence of this is when you think about your parents' political viewpoints. If you were asked why your dad was this affiliated with this party, or why your mom was affiliated with that party, or whatever, you'd have an answer. And it may have to do with their theology. It may be informed by that. But it probably also is informed by what was going on in their life at the time of their life, like when they grew up, what was going on in the world around them. And the same is true for you and me. And this doesn't mean that we have dismissed the significance of our faith, not at all. If that's when these two things come together, we have a tendency to use one to prop up the other. We all do. We all use it, and that's kind of where the tension really lies. But what if we were able to step back and view it just a little bit differently, not changing what you believe, maybe, or who you vote for, but to see it a little bit differently. Because where you stand depends on where you sit. And recognizing this allows us to open our hands, open our hearts, open our minds without changing our political viewpoint. But beware. If you do this, if you start down this road, you may change some of what you think and some of what you believe. That's not the goal. That's just an unintended consequence or an unintended outcome of this. Because when the law of Christ takes precedence in our life and begins to inform our conscience and begins to shape who we are and begin to incorporate knowledge and wisdom into that, it will shape and it will help shape our views and our thoughts on policy, platform, and legislation. It's not dynamic, it just is. So what do we do with this? What do we do about this? It's not complicated. I'm not going to talk about anything new, but I just want to land this a little bit and give you 3 things about what we can do to kind of the way forward. These are things that you probably have heard before, but sometimes you just have to say what everybody knows so that everybody remembers to do it. So the first thing is this. This is the way forward. Listen. Listen. That's it. Listen to people who don't experience the world the way you do. Right? Listen to people who don't experience the world the way you do. The haves, the have-nots. Christians, unchristians. Young, old, black, white, Latino, Asian, gay, straight, married, not married, single, new citizens, old citizens, those who are not yet citizens, military, maybe people who are anti-military. Like, listen to people who don't experience the world the way that you do. This is going to help you. It's going to help you with the law of Christ. It's going to inform your conscience. It's going to help you incorporate knowledge and wisdom. It's going to help you love unconditionally all people. Listen. Second thing is this: learn. Learn something. Be curious. Pay attention to the frontiers of your ignorance. Pay attention to the frontiers of your ignorance. Don't turn away. Don't turn off the TV. Don't put that book down. Don't, just because it disagrees with your worldview. Be a student. Don't be a critic. Not just a critic. You're an amazing critic, by the way. We are all amazing critics. And without even a single lesson. Like, we're just amazing critics. Some of you mute the TV so you can do your own commentary. Would you pause and become a student, not just a critic? Otherwise, you're going to discount every bit of information that doesn't fit inside your currently flawed, potentially, worldview. And if we do that, if we are just a critic, we quit learning. And when we quit learning, something bad happens on the inside. If you're a Democrat, your Republican brothers and sisters aren't crazy. If you're a Republican, your Democrat brothers and sisters aren't crazy. They just sit in a different place, and they just see the world in a very different way. They may be crazy. Let's just put it out there. That's because all of us have a flawed worldview. That's because all of us have some work to do. That's why this tension happens. That's why sometimes if we can create this template, if we understand this template and we let it actually take root in our lives, it's going to be able to shape some things, but not everybody's going to be shaped by those same things. And so there's going to be things all over the place, which is why we have to love unconditionally. So listen, learn, and the last thing is love. Never burn a relational bridge over a political view. Because this goes back to Jesus. It goes back to the cross. It goes back to the epicenter of what we believe as Christians. The you beside you is more precious to God than your potentially flawed worldview. The person beside you is more precious to God than your potentially flawed worldview. If we could just even think that maybe, just maybe, our worldview may be just a little bit, maybe there's some work to do there. That's a good starting point. Because while both of you and the person beside you were still sinners, Christ died for both of you. And how dare I burn a relational bridge between someone for whom Christ died because of a political view? That makes zero sense. Why burn that relational bridge? Christ died for them just as he died for you. And if you were to love them as Christ loved you, why would you let that kind of stuff kind of get in the way? Why would you burn that bridge over a political view? Our responsibility is to show our divided nation what it looks like to disagree politically while at the same time loving unconditionally and praying for unity. Because at Calvary, at the cross, we lost our right to do anything less than that. Let me pray for you this morning. Father, thank you so much for this reminder that the law of Christ is something that we, as Christians, as Christ followers, live under. And that we are looking to help shape who we are, to help inform our conscience so that we can incorporate knowledge and wisdom that we've accumulated over the years and years and years, the way that you are allowing us and that you're talking to us through, and allowing us to gain information and gain an insight and knowledge to the capacity that we have right now. Thank you that we're able to do that. Lord, that we don't have to fear new, we don't have to fear science, but we can know what you're doing and how you're working, how you work in the world even more today than we did before. God, right now, I just pray for all of us that we will just kind of take a little bit of a step forward to say, you know what, I'm going to let the law of Christ inform my conscience and leverage the knowledge and insight and wisdom that comes from that to help shape what I view about what needs to be done, policy and platform and legislation in this world. That we won't let anything or anyone divide us as the church over our one mission, our one message, and our one command to love everyone as you've loved us. God, that we will listen to those who have experienced the world differently than us. That we will learn from them so that we can understand who they are, so we can be like Paul, that we can become all things to all people, that we can win as many as possible, and that we can love unconditionally. God, you did it in the early church. You've done it throughout the last several thousand years and beyond, and you're going to do it in the future. Do it again in us, God. Do it in us. And we just thank you for who you are, God.